I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's workshop, David Croft. David is partner of Myers Roman, Friedberg, and Lewis, specializing in cybersecurity and blockchain and cybercurrency. Jim Myers is vice president and team lead at Howard Hanna Business Advisors, providing sell-side advisory services. Sean Ward is the founder of CEO Midtown Capital Advisors, specializing in sell-side advisory service, business consulting, and debt restructuring. And Reed Tilliston is ETA entrepreneur and professor at Weatherhead School of Management, specializing in ETA. He's also the first ETA PhD candidate in the United States. And Reed is a mentor at Promise Partners. Please welcome our speakers.
Thanks, Dale. Good morning. Great, good. So we've got a relatively intimate group, and Dale introduced us, so we're just going to jump right in. One item of housekeeping. If you have questions, ask them. We're taking them as we go. We want this to be an interactive dialogue. So we're going to be talking about selling smart, avoiding pitfalls, where can we find success, and most of my questions I'm just going to direct to the panel at large. So guys, whoever wants to take the first one, my first question is, what are some important things, one or two things that a business should be considering when they're getting ready to sell? And when should they start thinking about these things?
All right, I'll start off here. I think that the most important thing is to start as early as possible. Sometimes it can take 2 to 3 years of prep to get a business ready to sell. Hiring an advisor can help you speed up that process, obviously, but starting early is my number one piece of advice to anyone thinking about selling.
Go ahead. Thanks, Jim. I would add to that starting early, but start while you're healthy, right? Start when you can do it. Don't wait and don't leave it behind for a loved one to do for you. Unfortunately, have a lot of those conversations where we're talking about what do we do with a man or woman's life work after some unfortunate health care event occurred. So do it while you can.
Absolutely. And the only thing I would add is put the pride aside and make yourself redundant to the business, because as Sean said, you do not know when that health issue is going to strike. You don't know if your wife's going to say, I'm going to leave you unless we start going on some vacations. So if you run the business and make yourself redundant, you have that optionality when the time comes.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think you could start planning to sell when you start your business?
I always say start with the end in mind, right? I mean, if you're starting a business and you don't want to hold it for life, start the day you buy it. I mean, think about all the systems you have to put in place, the management teams you got to put in place, making sure your financials are good and clean. I mean, how many people in the room here that are on the advisory side see financials where they're running all sorts of personal BS through them? I mean, those all take a lot of time to unwind to make you credible to buyers. And starting with the end in mind is a great thing to do.
It's a great example. When I started my business, I was thinking about the end, right? When I started my first job, I was thinking about the end. Why do you work? To retire, right? And begin that process. It's a hard process, but when you look internally as a business owner, you can start thinking of ways that you can be creative to work your way towards the door, right? The future is unknown, but the closer you can get to the door, or take more vacations, be able to leave the business and not have to worry about the lights being turned on or the products being pushed out on time. Look at your team, right? Look inside the business and see who you can identify as an heir apparent if it's not a family member. But the more you can work yourself out of the day-to-day, the better you're going to be.
Yeah, and can you hear me okay without this, by the way? Yeah, okay. Yeah, the one thing I would add, too, is if you're a business seller in this environment, you have so many advantages because there's so many young people that want to go out there and buy businesses. And I know because I teach them, I mentor at Promise Partners. So begin with the end in mind with who you sell to as well. I mean, you can get to know the buyer, do references on them, ask for what their long-term vision of the business is. Because I've started to study seller satisfaction, and one thing that I can tell you is that sellers that take intentional, vision-based action in their sales tend to have much higher levels of satisfaction post-sale than those that don't. And this is not for people that own businesses that are doing $100,000 of EBITDA per year. We're talking about those that are doing, potentially millions of dollars of EBITDA. So my guidance to sellers is really scrutinize the buyers and take that same mentality of begin with the end in mind with who you ultimately choose to sell to.
Thanks, gentlemen. I have a little bit of a different perspective from the professional service provider perspective, especially in the legal field. One of the things that we are faced with when a company either comes to us and says they want to sell to X, Y, and Z, or buy X, Y, and Z is the due diligence piece. And a lot of these companies that are coming in and looking to buy, they're asking for documents that go all the way back to the beginning. And if you've got a company that's been around for a long time, that's a daunting task. So when you are either advising your business owners or you are a business owner, it's really important to start from the beginning, not only for an eye to sell, but it's a great way to run your business. If you're making sure that you've got all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, and admittedly, I'm a little OCD on things like that, of course, business tends to get in the way of those types of things, but it's really important if you can advise your business owners to start doing those things, start preparing to sell your business, even if it's far away in the horizon. It's just great from a business hygiene standpoint. So what do you guys see as common mistakes that owners, what do you come across as far as common mistakes for owners that are looking to sell their business?
I think we all have a treasure chest of war stories on this one. One topical one this year. We had an LOI. We got the amount we wanted. We did a payoff on a lease. Look at all the payoffs, and the owner didn't know how much money he owed. So when you do your after tax and how much cash you're gonna get after you close, it wasn't enough. So know your balance sheet, right? Betty, who runs your books, when you ask her for the loan payoffs, you have to really understand where that's at. So just know your business a little bit better was kind of the thing. But we couldn't have known that until we went down that process. It's unfortunate, but it happens.
I think having realistic expectations of time and the amount of energy that goes into a sale is really important up front, especially. And I like to have checklists. I'm kind of a checklist guy. And you talked about due diligence. Start it the day you think about selling. I mean, really start putting together, with somebody, either yourself or with your advisor, a data room, getting everything put together. Look at your quality of earnings. Look at your tax returns. Look at that lease that has to be assigned, because sometimes there's unsavory landlords out there that like to destroy deals at the last minute. And then the last thing I'll say is just be realistic on time. I said that before, but I had a client that called me literally a week ago and said, "Jim, can you sell my business by the end of November?" And I was like, "Yes." We all know what the next comment was, right? At what price? And people want full value fast, and unless you're a very exceptional business, that's very difficult to do.
And the two things that I'll add to that is, as a business seller, really understand what you're going to do after you sell the business. And Nick and I talk a lot about this. It's not just a generic thing like I'm going to spend more time playing golf, or I'm going to spend more time traveling, or spend more time with my wife or cooking, but really have a tangible idea of what you're going to do. Because when you're selling a business, your happiness level is here. On average, after you sell, your happiness level goes down significantly, and then it slowly creeps back up. But again, those sellers that minimize that drop, knowing that it's coming, it's because they have a tangible idea of what they want to do after, and oftentimes that entails in some form staying involved in the business, whether it's, one seller of a distribution company in the Mountain West, just told the buyer, I want to come back and have lunch like every Tuesday at noon. I just want to be here. I want that connection, because he knew himself well and he was pretty satisfied with that. Whereas, someone that sold a medical records company in Chicago decided that they just wanted to have a clean cut after like 2 months and then do all these generic things. And the individual was rolling in the dough, made a lot of money off of it, but he's not that happy in his post-sale role. So be strategic, know yourself, and have a tangible plan of what you're doing. And I know a guy, he has a pressure washer, or not a gutter cleaning business, which I love those businesses, by the way, doing about $30 million of revenue, $8 million of EBITDA. He is waiting to sell, unfortunately, likely to private equity right now. But the reason he hasn't sold yet is that he's building on Facebook a nice community, a nice following, right? And he's teaching people how to scale their Main Street businesses and how to ultimately go out and buy them. And he's not going to sell his business until he knows he has enough of a community built full time so he can avoid that depression drop afterwards. So that's what I encourage sellers to think about.
That's a great question.
That's a out of the box type mentality, I think, that you don't often see, Reed, where sellers aren't necessarily thinking about how can I emotionally deal with selling my business. I think a lot of sellers think that when the deal closes, they're done and they're on to retirement or the next thing, and what they've built is no longer theirs and they're no longer involved. Can you guys talk a little bit more about the emotional piece? Because I don't think, as service professionals at least, we're looking at legal issues or dollars and cents and things of that nature, but we're not really thinking about the mentality that an individual has to have, or the things that they need to do to prepare for selling something that they quite probably built from the ground up.
I think there's two spectrums, two part of that spectrum. One is pride. Someone's built something really awesome and they have great expectations of what they can get on the sale side. And then sometimes you have the opposite, where people are less than confident about what they've built. And as an advisor, we have to help them understand that you've built a great business and it's very sellable. You've got to do a few tweaks here, but there's people on both spectrums, and understanding where they are on that spectrum is very important. And as a seller, you should be comfortable and confident in your business, because it shows to buyers if you're not.
The emotional piece it's real, and it's almost impossible to break. Some examples, working through a transaction right now where we got the number that the client was seeking, and it's been over a month since they've moved on the LOI. It's an emotional thing, and we asked them the question, what are you going to do after retirement? One's going to be on a beach, and it's multifamily. There's a buy-sell agreement from 1967 that we're working through.
Great.
One of the family members doesn't know about the sale, right? There's all sorts of quirks that go on there, and Nick laughs because you've seen it. He wants to rebuild wine presses, right? Old Italian wine presses. If you ever made wine from scratch, it's a process. Well, we got that $1 million offer, and it became real. I think that going down the sales process was an exercise, and then, thanks to organizations like Promise Partners, there's tons of people who want to buy $1 million business, right? It might be doing $2 million in revenue, $250,000 to $500,000 in EBITDA. There's a lot of people who want to buy those and maybe turn those into a platform company. But breaking the emotional attachment, how do you do it? I think you have to appeal to the human side, right? You try to buy a business. You got to get that owner or family, for dinner. You have to appeal to your inner values, because they don't want to sell that company to someone who doesn't have those same kind of values. Their people are so important. They are family. Oftentimes you see nepotism in a small business, so you will literally have nieces, nephews, cousins working in the company. So if you don't have that kind of soft touch to, everyone can go out and find $1 million, but if you can't appeal to their values, you have a harder time actually getting that deal done.
I would say along those lines too, lots of people have different reasons they're going to sell. I've been trying to buy a guy's business. He's literally 86 years old. He's still comes into work every day. He's not ready to sell, and he's made it clear that he's going to die at his desk. And his wife died a year ago, and he still keeps coming in. And he brought her in for 3 years when she already had a stroke, and put her in front of a computer to watch videos all day while he kept working. So there's different motivations. Other people, it's not getting the top dollar. It's making sure their employees are taken care of. Some people, it is their ego is driven by the top dollar. What I encourage people to do is read. Like there's a book called Finish Big by Bo Burlingham. There's also books on what to do, to figure out so that you don't get to that point and have seller's remorse.
And I think a really critical part of that, and I know there's a lot of intermediaries in the room, but working with a credible intermediary can help so much with that process from the seller perspective. Because the worst thing is that when you get a deal to the finish line and it doesn't close, and two things that I noticed is working with the right intermediary, and then secondly, on both the buy side and, can you hear me in the back okay still? Yeah, both on the buy side and the sell side, if the seller is involved with a peer group, like an EO or a YPO, oftentimes that peer group would have done that emotional vetting for them as well, which is critical. And if the buyer is involved in the group, whether it's a promise partner or another incubator, they're getting coached by really credible people as well about those emotional issues, so that at least that way they don't stay in their head. So I think a key takeaway is use competent help. As I know a lot of the intermediaries in the room can say here, there's competent help and there's not competent help. Choose your intermediary wisely, and second most, have a peer group on both the buy side and the sell side.
Well, and sometimes the business broker who brought you together is not the competent intermediary. He's simply an ad agency or, a connector, and they're not necessarily, they just want to connect the buyer and a seller, and they're not necessarily the competent intermediary.
And so often it happens that when you take the incompetent intermediary out of the deal, things just fall into place permanently. And some of the best intermediaries know how to deal with bad intermediaries, and it's a critical thing.
Yeah.
What do we look for when looking for a competent intermediary?
Great question. I can tell you what I would do. It's all stand up.
Hey guys, use the mic because it's being recorded.
Cool. Sorry about that. Yeah, for me, I want to talk to as many of their clients as I possibly can. And I know that I've gotten there when I talk to ones that give the stellar reviews, that give the mediocre reviews, and the ones where it was a learning experience for both parties. And then when I get to that point, if I still feel gut level good about it, then I'll move forward. That's like kind of the deeper answer. The more basic one is check them out on LinkedIn, see how long they've been doing it, see what their transaction volume is, right? Do all that stuff as a necessary one, but the key thing is to talk to the references, in my experience.
I'm highly biased, so I'm going to say Reed is right.
They hit it the nail on the head. I think just during conversation, you can kind of pick up on someone's inexperience, right? How many transactions they've been through, how well they know the business, right? They give you an idea of the questions they ask the business owner before they kind of come out to market. I'm working on buy side and sell side. I had an example. I had a sell side advisor trying to explain to me how cash flow works. And my background being a credit officer and being a former lender, that's kind of how I prided myself in the market, was being able to do a cash flow on the spot that I knew the bank can underwrite and approve. Well, I look at his background, he sold guns and ammo for the last 15 years. So again, I wasn't going to sit there and let him tell me how to do my job, but I had to listen and be nice.
Well, if he's like selling guns and ammo,
Well, he lives nowhere near here, so that was good.
accept his price or else.
You can also get a good feel for the intermediary by talking to your other professional service providers. If you're ramping up or you're in the middle of a deal, most of the time your attorney, your CPA, whoever you're working with is going to have a good feel for the other person or that intermediary, and maybe they have experience with them too.
Yeah. I would also add, don't rely on friends because they're your friend and they're an attorney or you're their friend. Make sure they're qualified.
Right.
And to build on that, if you have investors or board members, do not rely on them either. do the analysis independently. I cannot underscore enough how a bad intermediary can slow or kill a deal. And if you remove that bad apple, how quickly the deal can happen thereafter. Seen it countless times.
You got a question up back there?
Yeah, just one thought, just to tag off that from you see, I've talked to a few people this morning that are employees of companies looking to buy out or something like that. Get your own advisors as well, because a lot of times, say if you've got a relationship where it's the seller to CPA or something like that, just it can get pretty awkward pretty quick. So from the get-go, look for your own advice.
Absolutely. You know, those deals tend to often be the most difficult. It's usually the really big deals that are the easiest.
As you're nearing the end of the sales process, many times there's a shortfall of cash. So maybe the seller really wants, it's an employee, or they found the right strategic fit, but that buyer lacks enough liquidity from the banking side to get the deal done, and they have to go back and ask the seller to carry paper or carry more paper other than what was expected up front. How many times have you had deals fall apart or had to have deeper conversations where the seller they were so anxious to be done with it, but then they've reached their point where I can't do that, and coaching them through that process?
I'll build off of what you said earlier about doing the due diligence and looking at the balance sheet ahead of time and how much cash you need at the close, one, to clear all your debts. But the other thing is understanding the buyer ahead of time. And you should know well in advance of a close how much cash they have and are they qualified to get a loan from, a good lender. Steve, you out here? I don't know if Steve's here. Yeah, Steve Barretto, there you go. If you have a good lender, you're going to know how much cash you have at the close. And as an advisor, you're also coaching your sellers about what the reality of the market is. Whether you're going to be expected to take an earnout or seller paper or some type of consulting agreement. And so really it's all, it happens at the end, it does, but it shouldn't if you plan right, both on the seller knowledge side and knowing who the buyer is.
You know what, Jim, one thing I wanted to add to that is it's not always the cash piece. It may be other things, just weird curveballs that are thrown by third parties that just don't get the deal. For some reason, the SBA just keeps popping up in my mind for a deal that they I wouldn't say they almost wrote, but it almost did not close. The SBA was requiring at the 11th hour, which happens in other areas, but they were requiring at the 11th hour, I think, a 30-year lease on a property to kind of match the loan, and no landlord is going to do that. And it's a ludicrous request, right? But the bank is kind of checking boxes, and they're like, if that box isn't checked, we're not going to close on this. And so it took some time, but my point being is you've got outside curveballs from possible third parties like lenders or other parties like contracts, if you're assuming contracts and you might have a customer. And they may come into the deal and it might be the biggest customer that you have, and they might come into the deal and say, we're not going to assign this contract, or the lender might say, we're not going to finance because of this particular point. And sometimes you can do all the due diligence in the world, but you get to that 11th hour and I mean, that's another question I was going to ask you guys, but you get to that 11th hour and sometimes you can't anticipate those things. So,
Yeah, that's just part of the coaching, right? Up front, you got to ask hard questions. A lot easier to do those, structuring conversations up front when there's no emotion. So when that does happen, you can say, well, we did walk through this as a scenario. Kind of explain it to business owners relatively simply. If you want 5 times multiple, the bank will give you a 3, right? Understand cash flow leverage. Maybe put 1 down from the buyer and take 1 back. Explaining to them how that works, and then working closely with their tax accountant to go through it is just kind of part of the process for us. But in general, expect to hold paper.
And, to build upon that and to add to it, it's so critical to the point about emotions, right? And by the way, Dale, I got the mic this time, so thank you for that. It's so critical to take the emotions out of it as early as you can by having so many things laid out in the LOI, because the LOI is not as emotional. The purchase agreement, so much more emotional in that process. The more you can do earlier, ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. Second thing, what's the most leverage that a business owner has when they're selling? Just shout it out. Name some things. What's the leverage that you really have as a business owner while you're selling? What do you want to focus on? Louder? EBITDA, performance, right? The most critical thing, because these deals fall apart all the time, is just to keep on growing EBITDA all the way through the sale, right? Because if a buyer's having cold feet, if the lender's complaining about a 30-year lease option, right? It is amazing how 30% EBITDA growth, right, year over year, might mitigate the need to not have that 30-year lease, right? Or it might mitigate the need of, oh, you want this indemnity cap or you want this whatever. If the business is growing during the sale process, that is the best way as a seller to position yourself to get what you want and to get the deal closed, in my opinion.
Growth covers all problems generally.
Yeah, and just just want to make everybody can hear me. Just to the initial question on, how do you find the right intermediary? So I see this from, the investor's perspective. So I lead origination for a lower middle market private equity, private credit firm. We're investing in essential industry. So that's my plug for all the intermediaries in the room. But I think one thing I appreciate as a buyer is just responsiveness and communication. And I think if you're trying to find an intermediary, that's something you should really prioritize as well, because you have to remember when bankers are shopping your deals around to buyers like me, they're shopping it around to 50 to 100 potential buyers. And if they're not responding to you, a potential client or a client, then they're probably not going to respond to me. So I think communication and responsiveness is something that really is important in the overall process. And again, as a buyer, it's something that I appreciate. And, we'll track the intermediaries who aren't responsive on our deals, and, who we might follow up with but who don't get back to us and stuff like that. So I think it's just something to keep in mind when you're shopping around.
That's an excellent point across the board. I think any of the professional service providers business owners are working with should be responsive. And if they're not, you might need to take a second look at that. Another question?
Do you guys have any stories about an employee purchasing a business? Because you guys are talking about like weeding out the emotional issues. It seems like when the employee and like the owner are going through due diligence and getting to the LOI, that it's probably like very emotionally fraught. Like, why don't you trust me? We've known each other for so long. I was wondering if you've been through that experience.
Yeah, I have. So the best practice of it is to say, listen, I want to sell you the business and we're going to negotiate. We're going to have to close this deal in 60 days. If the deal isn't closed over this time frame, you are going back to being a team member and we are not going to talk about this again, right? So to have a really crystal, nothing clarifies like clarity caller on that there. I have sold a business to one of my team members. At the time, the team member had 10% profit sharing, and the deal ultimately closed, but it was with that constraint on it. And then it was a franchise business that I sold, so the valuation was pretty clear. We just went to the franchisor and asked for like fair valuation multiples, and we went from there. The more important part of it, I love this team member. She has changed my life for the better in so many ways. The truth is, I probably would have given her the business for free, right? Because I had that kind of like rapport and I had that kind of love with her. Because at the end of the day, small business for me is all about the relationships that I build with people. So overall, it went very smooth. Of the people that I talked to in that process that had less smooth situations, it was around having that open-ended, kind of issue around it. Because as a business owner, you have to be ready for the fact that deal may not close, and then you would have lost like your star team member, which can have a serious negative material impact on the business. So again, key takeaway is that don't have too much key man risk, because if you don't have that key man risk and that person left, then you'd be in an okay situation. So just some thoughts there.
Reed's point is very well taken. I've done a handful of these over the years, and at least from an attorney standpoint, they're often the easiest deals to do. It's not a whole lot of due diligence on either side because they both know each other, and so they're talking to each other every day, and it's a lot more friendly than seller over here and buyer over here. And obviously, one of the things that we did, or that we had to do in a few of these deals, is encourage the employees to go out and get their own attorney and get their own service providers. I think this point was brought up before, but you should not be using the same service providers. You need to have independent people looking at these things. But from my perspective, it's a much easier deal. But Reed's point is very well taken. If it does fall apart, you have to think about that before you get into it.
Just like one comment on that. One of the exercises that we go through is, before the owner sells, like what employees could buy it. And my favorite answer is, well, Joe would be the best, but he's got no money. Well, I can find you money, and SBA is pretty easy. You take back 10% paper, right? Start going through it, and these owners have never sold before, so they don't know the game. And that's just part of it. Ask a question and kind of run at that person, because that person, they have the trust, they have the know-how, they know how to run the business. The bank is going to look at this deal and say, okay, everything looks great, but do they have experience? Because that'll kill a deal, the old character part of a deal. And so always encourage. Look at employees. If there's too much key man risk, then that's definitely a concern. But go inward first and then outward.
And the best part about looking at employees too is that you don't have to worry about if you're telling them that you're going to sell the business as well, because I've studied this, and a lot of times, sometimes it works out well when you tell the team members you're selling. Sometimes it works out terribly. Sometimes it works out well if you don't tell them you're selling. Sometimes it works out terribly. So by selling to the team members, or even doing an ESOP potentially, as a business seller, you mitigate those risks.
What has your research told you?
The key takeaways on that note in particular.
Yeah.
The key takeaways is that on the note of if you should tell your team members or not tell your team members, there is no statistical difference on if it's a wiser choice to do or not. Okay. It is going to be a risk either way. Okay. Yeah, correct.
Different set of risks.
Yeah, different set of risks. I can tell you credibly that as a seller, if you want to be happy, avoid being blinded by the price. If you think your business, if the market for your business is say 8 times EBITDA and someone offers you 15 times for it, you probably are not going to be happier if you take that offer, because you're going to be blinded to other considerations such as team members, post-sale involvement, et cetera, et cetera. I can credibly tell you not to be blinded by the price. I can credibly tell you if you want to be satisfied and fulfilled, use a competent intermediary. But I cannot credibly tell you that telling employees or not telling employees is going to lead to any kind of better outcome.
Interesting. We got a question in the back here.
I just wanted to point out that sellers have a lot of options when you're trying to sell your business, and one thing to consider is employee ownership, ESOP, and also worker-owned cooperatives. So that's just my plug for a lot of the things that you're talking about that are seller concerns, considering legacy, what happens to your employees, what do you want to do? Do you want to stay with the company? You can. So always knowing your options, and there are other options rather than just one single employee.
And it's super interesting when it comes to ESOPs on the point of diligencing intermediaries. Really important if you're thinking about doing an ESOP. I highly encourage you to talk to 30, 40, 50 individuals that have gone that route, because there's a lot of great things about employee ownership. There's also a lot of governmental constraints and regulations that come with that as well. So there's a very wide range of owner experience shares around that. Yeah.
ESOPs don't pay income tax. The income tax savings is how you fund the acquisition through the ESOP.
And not even that, it's the only instrument in the U.S., they'll hear me on this, where you don't have to pay taxes on your debt. Yeah. You can get debt-free financing with ESOPs.
Yeah.
If you hate taxes If ESOPs are the only instrument that I know of in the entire world where the debt payments are pre-tax. Debt payments are pre-tax. SBA debt payments can be pre-tax. So if you hate if you hate taxes, you will love ESOPs.
Sean, did you have a question or anything to add to that?
We're doing good. ESOPs are wonderful, everybody.
Great, great. Well, we talked about some of the runway leading up to selling your business. Let's talk about, in your experience, some of the big things that have speed bumps, potholes, pitfalls, whatever you want to call them, things that have come up to surprise a seller in the course of a sale that either derailed it or how they worked around it.
I'm going to go on the derailment side. Got a lot of war stories this year.
Yeah.
Greed is part of it. Had a $5 million deal explode over a $200,000 earnout. It's crazy. In general, the business owners haven't gotten to where they are by listening to people. A lot of them are pretty stubborn. I think that, I think about my father as a business owner, and, he kind of just does what he needs to do in the moment. But this example this year where, you have pricing and you have, valuation ranges, and it comes down to a lot of different things. And, the seller's motivated was by one thing. And, it's just unfortunate that the market didn't want to absorb that one thing. Got close, but, time kind of will tell what happens with that one. But oftentimes the business owner's objectives in selling don't come out to the very end. So kind of on that journey.
I guess my experience is when you have challenges when the seller wants to handle the due diligence process themselves, and they're like, okay, you're done. You've introduced me to my buyer. This is good. I'll handle it from here. And I always say, no, that's the wrong thing to do, because the due diligence is where things really start getting difficult. And you still need that buffer, you need that intermediary, you need that advice so that the due diligence actually concludes with the sale.
And to build upon those two comments, which I completely agree with, is on the buyer side, make sure that the buyer is willing to sign a personal guarantee for an imperfect business. Because a lot of buyers, they'll take a class and recurring revenue, fragmented customer base, growing industry. Yeah, I'll sign a personal guarantee for a business like that. It's making $1.8 million of EBITDA and is going to, live the dream life. But then when they start deal sourcing, they realize how hard it is to find that perfect business, and that it doesn't, although some do exist, but very few actually exist. And now it's doing $600K, 35% customer concentration, which I can deal with, but am I going to sign a personal guarantee? I don't know. So making sure that the buyer is qualified and actually willing to sign the dotted line for those big loans and not walk away at the end.
Yeah. And I think you had asked in the previous one about couples that are looking for searches. So make sure if you're PJing something that your significant other's okay with that, because I can tell you, when I bought my first business and we had to sign a personal guarantee, that was about an hour-long conversation across the kitchen table.
I think it's also important for the intermediaries and professional service providers to understand the deal and the relationship between buyer and seller. And I think it's incumbent on the buyer and seller to bring them in, because I can't tell you how many times, we are very close with our clients. We usually intimately understand the deal, and then we get to document changes from the other side's attorneys, and they're completely out of left field. They don't understand the deal at all. They're not really bringing them in to understand things, or they've got, this CPA working on this particular section of the agreement, and this attorney working on this section of the agreement, and this person working on this section of the agreement, and no one really understands the deal. Meanwhile, the buyer and seller, they're holding hands and skipping down the road, singing Kumbaya, and the attorneys are just butting heads and fighting, and CPAs are fighting. So it's really important that everyone kind of understands the sentiment of the deal and the conversations going on between buyer and seller.
I would also say if there's multiple sellers involved in the selling company, they don't always have the same interest in mind. And the minority seller can blow out a deal at the 11th hour, and just be aware that you're buying, if you're buying the business, you're buying both parties at that time.
We got one in the back. He's 5 minutes.
I've just got a question about your ideal or not ideal customer. So when you have a new customer that walks in the door, what are the one or two characteristics that the seller has that you're like, oh yeah, this is going to be potentially an easier deal? And then what are the one or two characteristics you see you're like, this could be a tough one?
An easy one for me is, am I selling a business or am I selling a job? There's a difference.
Are you asking from the seller's perspective of a buyer?
Seller, for you as an intermediary, if somebody comes and say, hey, I would like to work with you, and I'm a seller, you know, what are the positive characteristics versus the warning signs during our first coffee date?
Yeah, expectations, value is the big one for me.
I want someone that will listen, really. I mean, we're not providing a commodity, so our services are valuable. I want someone that's actually going to listen to them. They may not agree with them, but I want them to listen.
One of my favorite questions to ask is, what's the longest vacation you've been on or could take without your business falling apart? And if someone says, I can't take a vacation, that's a tough business to sell. If they've been on a 3-month cruise in Europe, that tells you something.
Good point.
One more.
Quick question. What do you guys see or think about like rolling over equity in a deal?
Most of my clients don't want to do that.
I heard a lot of groaning when you asked that question up here.
I actually have an LOI out right now where the owners are contemplating holding 20% in the new co. And we've had a lot of long talks. They've talked to their attorneys. They've talked to their accountants. We're going to go to the proposed buyer's company next week to meet the team, to make sure it's real, to understand, values. There's all sorts of intercompany transactions that are now going to be part of the future mix. And then we're also negotiating out a future buyout of that minority interest. So it is difficult and probably not your first option if you can avoid it.
My personal bias is to sell deals 100% cash at close, right? Take the money, get out of there when I'm the seller, because I just don't want to be the owner, not owner anymore. What I will say, though, is that when it comes to rolled equity, boy, if I ever found a buyer that I thought was so good for the business and I really had faith in that buyer and I knew they could do a great job, even if I'm looking at, putting monies in a CD and getting 5% or money marketing 5%, if I thought they could really grow the business, I would absolutely roll equity. So in businesses that I have sold before, I've always wanted to find that dream buyer that I thought I'd be comfortable to roll equity with. Ultimately, quite frankly, I just never have. But my goal as a seller is to find someone that I want to roll 10, 20, 30% and watch them take it there. There's a great quote from someone I interviewed. They said that, the 80% cash I got for the business ended up being worth a heck of a lot less than the 20% rolled equity that they ended up taking in it. So it can be very lucrative financially for sellers if it's the right buyer, if it's the right business, and they really believe in the growth trajectory going forward. And a great way to bridge gaps on valuation as well. Because if a seller's like, I want to hit this number, it's like, fine, we can get you that number if you roll equity, and if the business grows, then yeah, you're going to have that number there. So it can be useful as a negotiating part as well. With that said, I like simple transactions. I like cash at close, get me out of there. I want to do other things, but there's certainly some upside for it with the right buyer.
Gentlemen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time and questions. Dale?
I'd like to thank David, Sean, Jim and Reed for their wisdom. To show appreciation, a donation is being made to the Effective Leadership Academy. And thank you again to our presenters.